1910 Kentucky. A quiet farming town where the fields stretched wide under pale moonlight, and the wooden church stood taller than any house. To the locals, it was a place of safety, a beacon against the wilderness that pressed in on every side. But beneath its steeple, something darker stirred. They called him the Midnight Preacher, a stranger who arrived one summer evening dressed in black, carrying no more than a worn Bible and a voice that could shake a room. The year was 1910, and in the rolling hills of Kentucky, the land seemed to carry both a promise and a burden. The fields stretched wide, heavy with corn and tobacco, and the dirt roads that cut through the valley bore the marks of wagon wheels, horses, and weary boots. Life here was slow, deliberate, and marked by the rhythm of labor and the turning of seasons. Most families lived scattered across the countryside in wooden cabins, their nights lit only by oil lamps and the pale glow of the moon. In such a place, faith was not just ritual but survival, a shared language that stitched together lives threatened by hardship, illness, and the wild unpredictability of nature. It was the church, rising above the fields with its spire pointing heavenward, that gave the town its anchor. For many, it was the one place where the chaos of the outside world seemed to bow before order. The church itself was not grand. Its wooden frame creaked with age, the pews worn smooth by decades of use. Yet it stood taller than any barn or homestead, and its bell, cast in iron and brought from the east years before, was said to carry for miles, calling the faithful from every corner of the valley. On Sundays, families walked or rode together, the men in simple coats, the women in plain cotton dresses. Children scrubbed clean and restless with energy. They filled the pews not only for worship but for community, to hear news, to mark births and deaths, to remind themselves that in their isolation they were not alone. In that place, words carried weight, and a preacher's voice was often the strongest authority they knew. But behind this reliance on faith was an unspoken undercurrent of fear. Kentucky at the turn of the century was still a frontier in many ways, dotted with isolated hollows where law seldom reached. Tales of bandits, drifters, and unexplained tragedies were traded like warnings, and for many, the devil was not a metaphor but a presence that could be felt in the chill of the woods at night, or in the sudden sickness that swept through a household. The church promised protection from these unseen forces, and yet it also cast long shadows. Behind the hymns and scripture, there was always the reminder that salvation came through discipline, through obedience, through the watchful eyes of the congregation itself. By lamplight, people whispered of sins that brought ruin, of those who strayed too far from the flock and never returned. Stories of hidden graves, of families who vanished without explanation, lingered in the edges of memory, half believed, half denied. In a place where news from the outside world arrived weeks late, rumor was as powerful as fact. And in the heart of that community, the church was both the keeper of light and a vessel for darker imaginings. It was where trust and suspicion lived side by side, where salvation and judgment were delivered from the same pulpit, and where, in the stillness of midnight, even the creak of its old timbers could stir unease. He came without warning, as if the earth itself had given him up one humid evening, when the crickets sang louder than usual, and the cicadas droned like restless machinery. The townsfolk never agreed on exactly where he came from. Some swore he had walked in from the woods. Others said they saw him step off the midnight train with no luggage but a Bible pressed to his chest. What they did agree on was his appearance. Tall, gaunt, wrapped in a black coat far too heavy for the Kentucky summer, and a brimmed hat that shadowed his face until he chose to lift it. When he did, people remarked on the sharpness of his features, the hollowed cheeks, the piercing eyes that seemed less like windows to a soul than lanterns in a cave, catching and holding whatever they touched. He called himself a preacher, though he did not carry the letters of introduction that most circuit ministers bore. His voice alone seemed enough to persuade. It was not loud but steady, a rhythm that climbed and fell like the rolling hills themselves, and when he spoke, people listened as if the air around him thickened. He announced that he would not take to the pulpit in the day, claiming daylight was the hour of toil, of distraction, when men's minds were dulled by plows and women's hands were tied with chores. The true time for worship, he said, was midnight, the hour when silence covered the land, when hearts were stripped bare, and when the voice of God rang clearest against the backdrop of darkness. At first, it sounded peculiar, but peculiar in a way that stirred curiosity rather than alarm. The townsfolk, long starved for novelty in their repetitive lives, found themselves drawn to the idea. To gather at midnight, to sit in the pews by lamplight and hear scripture spoken when the world outside lay asleep. It promised both mystery and intimacy. The first sermon he gave was unlike anything they had heard before. He read from familiar passages, but his interpretations bent them into shapes they did not expect. He spoke of judgment as if it were not distant but near, pressing upon their doors that very night. He described sin not as mere disobedience but as rot that spread unseen, staining bloodlines, corrupting communities until only fire or blood could cleanse it. His words carried an intensity that was both terrifying and irresistible, and when he paused, his silence pressed upon the crowd heavier than any thunder. Soon, more came. Farmers, still smelling of the fields, drifted in with their lanterns. Widows who seldom left their homes found themselves sitting at the front pews, clutching their handkerchiefs, weeping at words that seemed aimed directly into their hearts. Even men hardened by the minds who scoffed at gentler preachers sat stiff and alert as the midnight voice poured over them. He spoke as if he knew their secrets, as if he had already measured their guilt and was offering one final chance to be redeemed. And though no one recalled ever hearing him laugh or even smile, they said his presence filled the room more completely than daylight ever could. It began with whispers, the kind that traveled no faster than a breath across a dinner table, or the hushed voices of neighbors speaking over a fence. At first, the talk was simple curiosity. The preacher's midnight sermons, the strange insistence on gathering at hours when even the owls had fallen quiet. But curiosity soon twisted into unease and unease into suspicion. The widow Sarah Cole claimed she had passed the church on her way home from tending to a sick relative, and heard voices long after the sermon was supposed to have ended. They were not the sound of scripture, nor the measured cadence of hymns, but low murmurs swelling together like water rising in a hidden well. Some insisted it was prayer. Others said it was something older, darker, with no place in Christian worship. A boy named Henry, no more than 12, swore that he saw lanterns moving through the church basement windows well past midnight. The windows were half buried in the earth, their glass dulled with grime, but Henry described flickering lights and shadows that stretched unnaturally across the ground. His father dismissed it as childish fancy, though the boy insisted he had heard scratching noises like wood being carved or stone being marked. Within weeks, talk spread that the preacher was holding secret meetings apart from the midnight sermons, gatherings for only a select few, those who seemed most captivated by his words. By late summer, the stories grew heavier, more sinister. A farmhand failed to return from his shift in the fields. At first, people suspected he had fled debts or taken work in another town, but his tools were left behind, and no train ticket was ever purchased in his name. Then came the disappearance of a girl of 16, a quiet soul named Eliza, who had been seen walking toward the church one evening, clutching a small lantern. Her family searched the roads and woods, but no trace of her remained. Not long after, a traveling salesman was reported missing, last seen asking for directions near the church. 3 vanishings in a span of weeks was no coincidence in a town so small. Those who still trusted the preacher claimed it was the work of outsiders, bandits, drifters, or wild men haunting the forests. But others were not so quick to dismiss the growing pattern. Some swore they noticed changes in the congregation itself. Men who had once been quiet now carried themselves with unsettling confidence, their eyes sharp and watchful. Women who attended the midnight sermons came away pale, shaken, their lips moving as if reciting words they dared not speak aloud. There was talk of strange carvings appearing on trees near the church, symbols no one recognized, shapes that made even the most hardened men uneasy to look at for long. Every story seemed to circle back to the preacher, the man in black who spoke only at midnight, whose voice could draw tears and silence from the hardest souls. Some townsfolk whispered that he was not leading them closer to God, but binding them to something else entirely, something that fed on devotion, secrecy, and fear. The talk of a hidden congregation began almost by accident, whispered first by those who lingered near the church after the midnight sermons ended. Neighbors noticed that not everyone left when the service was dismissed. A handful would remain behind, moving quietly down the aisles while the rest of the flock shuffled out into the cool night air. Some said they saw these chosen few slip through a side door near the altar, guided by the preacher himself. Others recalled hearing the faint creak of the trap door that led down into the church basement, though no one outside the circle ever admitted to seeing what lay below. For a time, these murmurs were dismissed as gossip, yet the consistency of the details troubled those who paid attention. It seemed there were two congregations now, the one that sang hymns and recited scripture before lantern light, and another that began only when the lamps of the town had been extinguished and silence fell over the fields. Those who claimed to have spied on the gatherings described unsettling details. One farmer, unable to sleep, said he had followed the sound of voices and stood hidden among the trees near the church. What he heard was not the rhythm of familiar hymns, but a droning chant, a sound too low and layered to be produced by ordinary speech. He swore that the cadence seemed to rise and fall like the beating of wings, and though he could not make out the words, the tone filled him with a cold dread. Another account came from a young woman who had lived just across the road. She said she sometimes woke in the dead of night to see strange shadows flickering on the church walls, taller than any man, their shapes twisting unnaturally in the lamplight. The preacher himself seemed to grow more selective in those he invited to linger. The poor, the grieving, the restless, these were the ones he drew into his inner circle. He spoke to them not of salvation, but of redemption through trial, of strength gained through secrecy, and of bonds forged in silence. Ordinary sermons, already strange enough, began to take on veiled hints of these private teachings. He spoke of the pure who walk the narrow path, of those marked for greater work. The town began to fracture under the weight of suspicion. Families argued at their supper tables, some insisting that the preacher's words were holy truths, others whispering that he had divided the flock into sheep and something else entirely. What unsettled many most was the change in the chosen few. They no longer mingled freely with their neighbors. Their gazes lingered longer, their words grew clipped and guarded, and some began carving small symbols into the wood of their barns or fences, marks that no one recognized but all associated with the preacher's shadowed gatherings. The hidden congregation, though never openly acknowledged, became a presence in the town as real as the toll of the church bell, an unseen body that seemed to swell in number with each passing week. And though most dared not speak of it aloud, more than one family confessed to locking their doors tighter on the nights when the secret meetings were said to take place. The first disappearance might have been dismissed as misfortune, the sort of thing that happened in rural Kentucky, where men sometimes fled debts, drifted to another county for work, or vanished into the hills. But when the farmhand Daniel Price failed to return home after tending fields near the church, questions began to surface. His tools were found still leaning against the fence, his hat abandoned in the dirt. Neighbors muttered that he had been seen the night before at one of the midnight sermons, seated near the front, his head bowed lower than usual as the preacher's words echoed through the rafters. Within days of his absence, others began to recall strange things: a lantern light moving between the trees after midnight, the sound of wagon wheels on the church road long after the congregation had gone home. Weeks later, Eliza McCreary, just 16, disappeared while walking home from visiting a friend. She was last seen carrying a small lantern, her white dress faint in the moonlight, heading past the church on the quickest path back to her family's cabin. Her parents scoured the woods, calling her name until dawn, but only the lantern was found, extinguished and lying in the ditch by the churchyard fence. Some whispered that she had been lured inside, drawn by the preacher's quiet summons. Others believed she had stumbled upon one of his secret gatherings and paid the price for seeing what she was never meant to see. By the time the traveling salesman vanished, unease had spread like a fever. He was a stranger, a man passing through with a satchel of goods, yet he was seen speaking to the preacher in hushed tones outside the church one evening. The next morning, his horse was discovered tied to a post, its reins dangling in the dust, but the salesman himself was never heard from again. To the townsfolk, this could no longer be dismissed as coincidence. 3 gone in as many months, all with some tie, however faint, to the midnight preacher's gatherings. The town grew restless. Mothers barred their daughters from walking alone. Fathers sat up at night with rifles across their knees. Yet the midnight sermons continued, and the pews remained filled, as though fear itself had bound the people tighter to the church. For every disappearance, the preacher's voice seemed to grow stronger, his sermons more urgent. He warned of corruption in their midst, of hidden sins devouring the town like worms and fruit. He spoke of cleansing fire, of redemption bought not by comfort but by sacrifice. Those who still trusted him clung to his words as reassurance, telling themselves the vanishings were the work of drifters or wild men. But others began to see the pattern, to notice that the preacher's inner circle grew larger with each loss, his hidden congregation swelling even as families mourned their missing. The fear that crept through the valley was not just for the lost but for the living, for the realization that faith itself might have become the snare, and that those who sought salvation in the midnight sermons were walking willingly into a darkness from which others had never returned. When the town finally turned its gaze inward and demanded answers, it did so with hesitation, as though speaking ill of the preacher would invite ruin. For months, fear had silenced them, but the weight of the missing was too great to ignore. A group of men, weary farmers and a deputy from the nearest county seat, gathered their lanterns and made their way to the church under cover of night. The wooden doors creaked open with a reluctant groan, as if the building itself resisted intrusion. Inside, the air was colder than it should have been, heavy with a smell that clung to the nostrils. Damp earth, old wood, and something fouler, metallic and sweet, like rusting iron. Their footsteps echoed too loudly against the floorboards, and each man felt the hairs on his arms rise as if unseen eyes watched from the rafters. Behind the pulpit they found the first sign that the church was not what it claimed to be. A section of the altar, worn smooth by years of use, bore faint scratches in the wood, symbols carved carefully, almost reverently, their shapes strange and unsettling. They were neither scripture nor decoration, but marks that seemed to squirm when stared at too long. The men pried at the boards, and there, hidden beneath a rug and a false hinge, they uncovered a locked trapdoor. With effort and trembling hands, they forced it open. What rose from the darkness below was a smell so sharp and putrid that more than one man retched on the spot. Lanterns were lowered, casting long, quivering shadows on the walls of the chamber beneath. The narrow steps led into a hidden room dug directly into the earth. Its walls were lined with crude wooden crosses, each uneven, some splintered, all stained with dark patches that had seeped deep into the grain. In one corner, they found bones piled carelessly, at first mistaken for animal remains until a closer look revealed smaller shapes, fragile and unmistakably human. Among the dirt and debris lay scraps of cloth, a buckle, the fragment of a shoe that someone recognized as belonging to the missing girl, Eliza. The chamber seemed less like a burial ground than a place of offering, a space where something had been fed again and again. On a makeshift table in the center of the room, a ledger rested, its leather cover cracked and brittle. When opened, the pages revealed a chilling record, names written in a steady hand, each belonging to someone from the town. Many were still living, but several had already vanished, their names marked with a single word scrawled beside them, redeemed. The sight of it silenced the men, their lanterns trembling in their hands. They realized with dawning horror that the disappearances had not been random, but chosen, recorded, and sanctified by the preacher's own hand. Yet of the preacher himself, there was no trace. His small quarters behind the church were empty, the narrow bed neatly made, a single Bible left open upon the desk. Its pages rested on the final verses of Revelation, as though chosen deliberately, a parting message for anyone who dared to search. The man in black had vanished, leaving behind only the stench, the bones, and the knowledge that the church had been less a sanctuary than a vessel for something unspeakable. The church did not collapse overnight. Instead, it withered slowly like a body drained of blood. After the discoveries beneath the altar and the preacher's disappearance, the building was sealed. The doors were chained shut, the windows nailed with planks, yet the structure remained, looming over the valley like a warning too heavy to tear down. Families avoided the path that led past it. Farmers turned their plows away from the land nearest its fence line, as if the soil itself had been poisoned. For years, no bell rang from its steeple, yet in the silence of certain nights, some swore they could hear faint echoes of its toll carried on the wind. The legend of the midnight preacher did not fade with time. Instead, it spread, reshaped by each telling. Some swore he had walked into the woods that night, never to return. his figure swallowed by the black of the trees. Others believed he was still alive, moving from town to town under different names, preaching his midnight sermons to other unsuspecting flocks. A few whispered that he had never been a man at all, but something older that wore human skin for a season before discarding it. Whatever the truth, his absence seemed more haunting than his presence had ever been, for the town could not close the ledger of what had been lost. The families of the missing carried their grief in silence, but silence has a way of becoming inheritance. Children grew up hearing the stories of Daniel, Eliza, and the traveling salesman whose names were marked redeemed. They were taught to stay clear of the church ruins, but curiosity often led them to its shadow. Teenagers dared one another to press their ears against its boarded walls, claiming to hear the faint murmur of voices, too low to be wind and too steady to be imagination. Hunters passing through the valley spoke of lantern light flickering inside, though no one had entered for decades. As the years rolled on, the story of the midnight preacher became both warning and fascination. Traveling merchants carried the tale beyond county lines, and strangers arrived eager to glimpse the haunted church. They found a sagging frame overrun with ivy, its steeple leaning, its wood rotted soft in places, yet even in ruin it commanded unease. Scholars and clergymen came, some dismissing the tale as superstition, others declaring it a parable of blind faith. But those who lingered at night often left unsettled, unwilling to speak of what they thought they had heard beneath the floorboards or seen in the corner of their eye. For the town, the church became a scar, visible yet untouchable, a reminder of what trust can conceal. Generations passed, yet the memory of the preacher endured in the way doors were bolted more firmly at night, in the way neighbors watched strangers with narrowed eyes, and in the way every midnight seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for a voice to rise again from the shadows, calling the faithful into darkness. In the quiet valleys of Kentucky, the midnight preacher's shadow still lingers. Long after the man himself vanished into the dark, his sermons are gone, but the scars remain, in the abandoned church, in the whispered stories of those who lived through it, and in the ledger of names marked redeemed. What are we to make of such a tale? Was he a man consumed by power or something far older, cloaked in the authority of faith? And perhaps the most chilling question of all, how many other towns lost to time and silence hold secrets just as terrible, never unearthed? As you reflect on this story, I want to hear from you. What do you believe happened in that church beneath the Kentucky moonlight? Were the missing truly victims of a madman, or participants in something they chose to follow? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your voice adds another layer to these forgotten histories. If stories like this unsettle you, if they make you look twice at the shadows in your own town, then join us. Subscribe so you don't miss the next descent into the darker corners of history, where truth and legend intertwine, and where each forgotten place holds its own mystery waiting to be uncovered. The Midnight Preacher's Tale is not just a story of one church, but a reminder. Sometimes the things we trust most can hide the secrets we fear the most. Will you step with us into the next mystery?